Good evening. James McLaughlin. I'm the town engineer, and tonight we have Leslie Fields from the Woods Hole Group, who has been working on this study and report for the last 6 to 9 months. And we had a meeting prior to this that I think probably most of you attended over at the Rec Center. And this is our final public involvement meeting. The report and the recommendations are due at the end of the fiscal year, which with the state is June 30th. So after tonight's meeting, we'll be preparing a report to be submitted to Mass CZM, that's Coastal Zone Management, and following that up with the meeting and incorporating your comments in that meeting that we have with Mass CZM next week, and then finalizing the report shortly thereafter. So in terms of the format for today or this evening, Leslie will give a presentation on what their findings are to date, and I will have this microphone, and anyone that wishes to speak, I'll be the runner back and forth to get you on FCTV. So and the meeting, by the way, is being recorded by FCTV, and we're very grateful to them for being here this evening also. So without further ado, I'd just like to introduce Leslie and let her take it over.
What about mine? Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, I think I'm ready. Let's see. All right, my name is Leslie Fields, and I work at the Woods Hole Group. We're an environmental consulting firm that specializes in resiliency building projects, so resiliency to climate change, and also ecological restoration projects, among many other things, but those are the two that my group focuses on. And as Jim said, we've been working on this project for the last about 9 months. It is an assessment of coastal habitat and water quality in the Fresh River system, and we're looked at evaluating conceptual alternatives for restoring that system. So in terms of the outline for the agenda, I've got a project background and goals. Many of you that were here before have already heard that, but I'm going to go over it for anyone who's new in the audience. I'm going to talk a little bit about existing site conditions and what we were able to measure and delineate out there at the site. I'm going to talk about the alternatives analysis that we conducted, and then talk a little bit about recommendations and next steps. The recommendations are as you'll see, are recommendations that we are providing to the town and to CZM. They haven't made any decisions yet. They need to, think about what's in the report and what the recommendations are, and then, the town will be deciding how best to proceed. And then after that, I will take public comment and questions. And as Jim said, we do want to take your comments and feedback and incorporate that into this final report. We're sort of wrapping it up now. We've got a draft, but we want your feedback for that final report. Okay, so I'm first of all going to talk about background and goals. As many of you know that you live around the system here, one of the main problems is with shoaling or closure of the entrance to the Fresh River. The tidal flow that exits the Fresh River is not strong enough to move sediment out of the entrance. It's strong enough to move some sediment, but not when it gets partially blocked. It becomes really hard for those tidal velocities to move that sediment out of the channel. And then plus, the jetties, they don't do a very well of blocking that sediment that's moving along the coastline from entering the entrance to the channel. And so, as you know, that periodically blocks tidal flow to and from the Fresh River and prevents drainage from Sitter's Pond and Fresh River during heavy rainfall periods. So you get a super elevated water elevation inside Fresh River and also in Sitter's Pond. And actually the two ponds upstream, so Weeks and Shibricks as well. This requires the DPW to come in and maintain the channel. So when it's blocked, they've got to come in and dig it out. That's approximately once a month, more often in the winter, less in the summer, but overall on an annual basis, it's about 12 times a year. And it's been increasing that number of times they've had to maintain it in the last, 3 to 5 years. It also causes flooding in the basements of many people who live in the area. And it impairs the ability of the waterway to serve as a fish run for endangered eels and alewife and blueback herring. So that's where they need to go up the river to do their spawning and then come back. So that's an important aspect of this, is trying to maintain that waterway for fish. One of the other problems that we know is that there's degraded water quality and coastal habitat in the system. And so again, that shoaling at the entrance that blocks the entrance prevents flushing of the Fresh River system with cleaner waters from Nantucket Sound. And it also, the shoal inside Fresh River, which is pictured here, restricts propagation of that cleaner water from Nantucket Sound up into Fresh River, but also, as we've learned through this study, and you'll see, it also limits the ability of that system to drain very well. So it doesn't allow the water to come out very well either. And then we also know that there are a couple of outfalls that discharge untreated stormwater into the system, so that also impacts water quality and coastal habitat. Just I'll reiterate the project goals. The first one is to restore tidal flow. So the goal is to modify the system to improve tidal exchange without increasing flooding to surrounding properties. A lot of these properties around Fresh River Basin, the lower part of Fresh River, are very low in elevation. And so one of the things we're looking at, or looked at as a part of this study, was to try to restore tidal flow without causing flooding of the properties around the Fresh River. We also one of the goals is to minimize sediment accumulation. So we were looking at ways to alter the entrance to create more of a self-sustaining system that doesn't trap sediment. We're also looking to improve ecosystem habitat. So by that, I mean enhancing tidal flushing so that we could restore about 1.6 acres of coastal habitat and about 1,870 linear feet of a fish run. Come on in. And then also looking to improve water quality. So to enhance tidal flushing and remediate that stormwater pollution to improve water quality. So those are the 4 goals that we were working on with the project. This just talks about funding. I showed this slide last time. The town got a grant from CZM for $90,237. They are matching that with about $14,000 in cash and about $15,000 worth of in-kind services. Okay, setting. I just want to make sure we're all talking, we're using the same vocabulary here. So I don't have a cursor, but we've got Surf Drive down along the beach. We've got Mill Road over on the left. And then over on the right side of this neighborhood is Walker Street. I think there's a pointer here. Is this? Hopefully you guys can follow me as I'm going through here. We've got Fresh River Basin, that's labeled here. That's the lower part of Fresh River that we're calling the Fresh River Basin. That's the sort of the fattest, widest part of the Fresh River. And then there's the jetties at the entrance to that. That's south of Surf Drive, 2 jetties. There's the Fresh River Channel. So that's a very narrow little channel, shallow channel that connects Fresh River Basin with Sitter's Pond. Got Sitter's Pond to the north. Got this little isolated wetland between Walker Street and the Fresh River system that is connected to Fresh River by the stormwater system. So a piped infrastructure connects those 2 water bodies. And then obviously Surf Drive Public Beach, so the part with the bathhouse over on the right, but really that beach extends all the way over to the left, down Surf Drive, down to the end of Mill, and into where those beach cabanas start, beach houses start. So I just wanted to go over that so you all know what language I'm talking about when I'm speaking about the system. Okay, now we're going to talk about existing site conditions. As a part of this grant, we had an opportunity to look at water quality, collect a bunch of samples, and have those analyzed for water quality or water chemistry. And we took those samples at 3 locations. So one was that green dot there in the middle of, or they're all 3 red dots, right? 3 red dots. So one in Fresh River Basin, one in the stormwater system, so in a catch basin that the stormwater infrastructure is connected to. And then we took a couple of samples in that isolated wetland off to the northeast. And we had those samples analyzed for nutrients, so nitrogen, ammonia, nitrate, total nitrogen. And then we also had them analyzed for bacteria. Bacteria is important because this water body does empty out onto a public beach. And so we want to make sure that, we know what sort of, whether or not there's high bacteria levels in the pond. We also had an opportunity to put out some instruments and to have those instruments measure tidal hydraulics or water surface elevation, as well as physical parameters of water quality. And so those stations, there's one in Sitter's Pond up to the north, there's one at the green dot in Fresh River, and then one, I guess, at a blue dot down on one of the structures near the Surf Drive bathhouse. So at those locations, we measured water surface elevation, measured salinity, water temperature, and then the Fresh River gauge was a slightly different kind of gauge, and so it also measured dissolved oxygen, pH, and turbidity. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we collected through those programs. As far as salinity goes, I'll tell you a little bit about how to read these graphs. So the bottom axis is time, and then the left axis is units of salinity in PSU. The blue line at the top is what we measured in Vineyard Sound. The gray line is Fresh River, and the orange line is Sitter's Pond. And so what we see from this is that the salinities in Vineyard Sound, pretty typical of a marine environment, around 29.6 PSU. Pretty steady up there at the top. Sitter's Pond varied at the time we took these data, which was in February, between 6 and 20 PSU. There's a lot of variation in that orange line that you can see. A lot of that's influenced by rainfall. So as it, collects rainfall, it becomes fresher. It's also influenced, as you'll see in a minute, by some water from Vineyard Sound that does make it up into Sitter's Pond. Sitter's Pond was about 4 feet below the surface. That's a good question. We can get back to that in a little bit, but I think it was there's a halocline in Sitter's Pond, salty water at the bottom, and then there's fresher water at the top. We think that gauge was below that halocline, so it was getting some of the more. You're saying no because the halocline is much deeper. I know, but at the shoreline, it might be coming up higher. We were kind of right along the shoreline here. So what we see with Fresh River is that it fluctuates a lot. So basically, salinities increase on an incoming tide and decrease on an outgoing tide. So that all makes perfect sense. In terms of temperature, same sort of gauge, same colors, the graphs laid out the same. The water temperatures are lowest in Vineyard Sound, highest in Sitter's Pond. We see that the Fresh River water temperatures fall on that incoming tide and rise on an outgoing tide. There are state water quality standards for water temperature in coastal estuarine waters. And we know that during the time period we measured this data in Fresh River, that the temperature met the state standards for temperature. In other words, the water body is not impaired in terms of temperature, if that makes sense. And again, that's just in February, and then May and June. We had a gauge out there again in May and June, so 2 months. And both times it met state standards for temperature. Dissolved oxygen. This is something that was just in the Fresh River. We didn't measure it in Sitter's Pond or in Vineyard Sound. So Fresh River dissolved oxygen increases on the incoming tide, decreases on the outgoing tide. Here again, there are state standards for dissolved oxygen in these types of waters, and the dissolved oxygen in Fresh River met those standards, indicating that it's not impaired for dissolved oxygen during the time periods we measured it. Water quality chemistry. I hope you guys can read this. As I said, we took samples from Fresh River, the catch basin, and from that isolated wetland. Had them analyzed for these parameters along the top. And we did it sometimes before a rainfall, during a rainfall, and after a rainfall event. And what we found is that water quality in Fresh River did not meet state standards for total nitrogen, and especially not for bacteria. So we know that bacteria is highest after rainfall events, but in all cases, even before a rainfall event, the bacteria levels are higher than the state standards. So meaning it's impaired for bacteria and nitrogen. Bacteria comes from, a lot of times it comes from septic systems, but a lot of the people, the neighborhoods around here are sewered. So it could either be from, typically from waste from wildlife, waterfowl, things like that. And then the nitrogen is typically from, runoff from people's yards if they're using fertilizers, or possibly from upstream contributions, although we know that Sitter's Pond is relatively low in nitrogen, so it's not likely that that increased nitrogen is coming from upstream. Okay, tidal hydraulics. So now we're not talking about water chemistry anymore, but more about tidal hydraulics. This is a graph showing water surface elevation in Vineyard Sound, the blue line. The gray line is Fresh River, and the orange line is Sitter's Pond. And you can see a really dramatic decrease in tidal range between Fresh River and Sitter's Pond. So it's tidal range during the time we measured it in Vineyard Sound was 1.14 feet, whereas in Fresh River it's about half a foot, and in Sitter's Pond is about 0.37 feet. So there's some sort of attenuation or something causing that tidal signal from Vineyard Sound to be attenuated as it moves up into Fresh River and Sitter's Pond. That could be, it could be the culvert. It could be that shoal inside Fresh River. It could be just friction along the length of that channel. There's a number of things that can cause that attenuation. Another thing we see in these data are short-term increases in water level, both in Fresh River and Sitter's Pond, that aren't related to tides at all, but more related to things like winds and rainfall. So we see that in the data set as well. Another thing that we noted here is that, so that the elevation at the bottom of the culvert in Fresh River is about minus 1.6, so 1.6 feet below this tidal datum we call NABD 88. You can think of it as mean sea level, 1.6 feet below mean sea level. But we noticed that the lowest elevations from the water surface elevation data in Fresh River never reached that. So that indicates there's something that's causing or not allowing Fresh River to drain, as much as it might, because the lowest part of that culvert is quite a bit lower than what we see in this tidal signal. All right. I'm going to spend a few minutes on just this engineering assessment we did. The goal was to use some analytical methods for hydrodynamics and sediment transport to try to develop a tool that we could use to evaluate these conceptual alternatives. We calibrated the hydrodynamic model using all the data we collected, water surface elevation data. You can see here at the bottom these graphs of water surface elevation, both measured on the bottom axis and modeled on the y-axis in both in Sitter's Pond and Fresh River. And you can see that those points are all sort of centered around that line, meaning that the model did a good job of predicting what the data showed. And then we also created a longshore sediment transport model that was calibrated using cesium shoreline change data. So what do we learn from that model? Over there on the right is a graph of rates of sediment transport in the channel. If the line is above 0, that means there's transport landward into Fresh River. If the lines are below 0, that means there's transport seaward, moving out. So you can see in that upper right-hand graph that there's many more times when there's higher rates of transport in the seaward direction. So that means that when we have an unblocked system at Fresh River, there's a net sediment transport moving out of the system. And this is just in the channel, sort of seaward or south of Surf Drive. So there's a net seaward transport, sediment transport when there's an unblocked channel. We also looked at a partially blocked channel. So when sediment is partially blocking, but there's still flow coming in from the sound. And we see that during those time periods, there's really strong landward pulses of sediment that end up transporting sediment into Fresh River. That's why that shoal forms after a storm. And so you can see on that bottom graph how there's many more sort of parts of the blue line that are above zero, so landward pulses of sediment during storms. And this really, the bottom bullet there just says, this matches what we see. When we go out there after a storm, that shoal is a lot bigger than it was, before a storm. And when it's unblocked and when it's open, it does have the ability to maintain an open flowing channel. It doesn't just clog up all by itself without a storm coming. Another thing we did, and I found this, kind of pretty simple to see in this graphic, but we looked at the measured salinity data we collected. So the top graph is Sitter's Pond, and it's basically just how many times was the salinity, at between 10 and 20 parts per thousand. So, Sitter's Pond ranges between, what did I say, 6 and maybe 20 or 19 parts per thousand. If you look at the bottom graph, the salinity in Vineyard Sound is up around 29 parts per thousand. And if you look in the middle graph, that's Fresh River. And you can see on an incoming tide, there's a lot of salinities that match what we see in Vineyard Sound. On the outgoing tide, salinities match what we see in the upper graph from Sitter's Pond. And there's not much mixing in between. So what this tells us is that there's substantial exchange of water between Fresh River and Vineyard Sound during each tidal cycle. And that the residence times are low. In other words, if you put a particle of some contaminant in that water, it would, or sediment or anything that's floating around in the water, it would be in Fresh River for a very short period of time, under a day. Typically, lower residence times are indicative of good water quality. We know we have good water quality in Vineyard Sound, and we know from work that Huey and others have done in Sitter's Pond that water quality is also relatively good, at least the part at the top that's fresh. So that is an indication that any sort of water quality issues we measured in Fresh River are more due to stormwater, that stormwater system, and to the runoff from the developed properties. I'd rather wait till the end. Is that okay? Okay, all right. Okay, one of the other things we did was we looked at longshore sediment transport. I'm not going to go into too much about how we did this, but we did determine that transport, depending on wave approach direction, sometimes transport's going to the east and sometimes it's going to the west. And we know from looking at aerial photographs and from CZM's data on shoreline change that in this area right around Fresh River, there's sort of a divergence of sediment transport. So that's one reason why we see some erosion in this area. We did the calculations to find out that in any given year, there's about 20,000 cubic yards of material moving past this entrance to the Fresh River. So that's the volume of material that's moving past the Fresh River that the jetties have to sort of hold off from entering into the system. Okay, alternatives analysis. We looked at 5 different alternatives for this project. And they're listed here. We've got no action, let's doing nothing. We always have to look at the no action alternative, just to let you know what happens if the town decides not to proceed. Alternative 2 is dredging the shoal at the entrance to the Fresh River Basin. So that's dredging it down to elevation minus 1.5 and sort of bigger than what you can see there today. So it's areas that are underneath the part of the shoal that stick up above the water. So it's about 230 feet in from the edge of Surf Drive. So we would dredge the entrance to the Fresh River Basin. That's alternative 2. Alternative 3 is somehow modifying the culvert under Surf Drive to hopefully reduce that tidal attenuation and improve water quality and habitat value. Also, alternative 4 is to modify the jetties at the entrance to the Fresh River. The main goal there is to try to minimize the amount of sediment that can get into the system. And then alternative 5 is to implement some stormwater BMP, so best management practices, to try to remove the nutrients and bacteria that we measured there. And that box over on the right is an important box to understand. So anytime you have a goal for a project, you have to decide how you're going to measure success of a particular alternative in meeting that goal. So we developed metrics to help us evaluate how well these alternatives met the goals. So for the first one, minimize potential shoaling at the entrance. That was one of our goals. The two metrics are, does the alternative increase the rate of sediment transport through the entrance channel so that it can be more of a self-flushing system? Another metric was, can we increase the percentage of material that's moving along the beach that the jetties can trap and prevent from getting into the system? So for example, right now, if they're only trapping 10% of the material, can we rebuild them to a situation where they can trap 90% of that material so it doesn't end up in the channel? The second goal was to improve tidal exchange without increasing the risk of upland flooding. To improve tidal exchange, we'd like to see an increase in tidal range during non-storm conditions. And then, and this is an important one to note, we wanted to make sure that we weren't increasing risk of flooding to upland areas. And in order to do that, we looked at the maximum water surface elevation inside Fresh River during a very particular storm. So that's a storm that has a water level in Vineyard Sound that's just below the elevation of Surf Drive. If it's above the elevation of Surf Drive, it doesn't matter what we've done here. So we wanted to look at this sort of very specific case where if that water level at Vineyard Sound got up, and it wasn't like spilling over the road, but it was just under it, would any of these alternatives cause flooding of the upland areas surrounding Fresh River? So it's a very specific sort of condition we were looking at. In terms of improving ecosystem habitat, if we can increase the tidal range during non-storm conditions, we can have an effect on some of the areas that, for example, have invasive Phragmites growing in them. We can get more salt water in there to inundate those areas that have Phragmites. Those Phragmites will die off. We won't have those invasive species there. Another way to improve ecosystem habitat, another metric, is to decrease that residence time in Fresh River. So make it even shorter, maybe half a day, something like that. And then improve water quality. Metrics there were reducing residence time in Fresh River, and then also reducing pollutant loads to the Fresh River by doing something to the stormwater system. So those are the metrics we use to evaluate these alternatives. Now I'm just going to go through each one of these and tell you how each one measured up against the metrics. No action. I don't need to spend a ton of time on this, but basically, you don't meet any of the goals with this, right? You don't change the rates of sediment transport in the channel. You don't increase the percentage of sediment along the beach that can be trapped by the jetties. You don't increase the tidal range. You don't reduce the residence time, and you don't change the pollutant loads to Fresh River through the stormwater system. So the goals there, none of them are met, but we already know that. Okay, the next one, I'm going to spend some time on this. So this is dredging the shoal at the entrance to Fresh River Basin. I'm going to go through this slide, and I've got the next slide that just has that upper left figure on it so you can see it better, because I recognize you probably can't see it very well. So with this dredging the shoal at the entrance to Fresh River Basin, in terms of minimizing the potential for shoaling at the entrance. So the sediment transport potential on the outgoing tide is increased, so it can flush more material out if it lands in the channel. But those pulses of landward moving sediment during storms increase. So it's sort of a mixed bag there in terms of impacts. There are no changes with this particular alternative all by itself in trapping more sediment along the edges of the jetties. So we don't have any influence on the percentage of longshore sediment transport that's captured. So that goal is partially met. With improving tidal exchange without increasing the risk of upland flooding, there is a very small increase in tidal range during non-storm conditions, but it wouldn't overtop the banks of the river and impact the properties on either side. But during that one storm event I told you about where the water levels come up and they're just below Surf Drive, there is increased flooding to properties around Fresh River. And that's what that figure in the upper left shows, and I'm going to get to that in a second just so you can see it better. It's mainly the properties around Fresh River Basin, the ones on the eastern side. So we classify this as being a partially met goal. There are things that could be done to mitigate those increased flood risks, like maybe you could increase the elevation of those riprap or structures around the edge of the basin. You could also build an earthen berm or a sort of just a little berm landward of those structures to help hold some of that flood water out, or all of it. Until such time, again, as I said, the water overtops Surf Drive, and then those berms won't do any good because the water's coming from everywhere else. In terms of improving ecosystem habitat, as I said, there's a small increase in tidal range and a small reduction in residence time, so that particular goal would be met. And then improving water quality, again, small reduction in residence time, but there wouldn't be any change to the pollutant loads from Fresh River, so that goal is partially met. Okay, now I'm going to look at this next one here, if you guys can get a better idea. So, so the red line is sort of the flood extent during that storm condition right before the water overtops Surf Drive. So you can see those properties on the east. This is sort of oriented with sideways. So let's see. So east is to the top of the page. So you can see some of those properties on the east side of Fresh River Basin with increased flooding. And there are a number of homes that could be impacted by this if there weren't any mitigation, like berming or increasing the elevation of those structures. A number of those homes have been elevated. And so, you know, they wouldn't, the structure itself would not be impacted, but there are probably 5 or 6 homes that haven't been elevated that could be impacted by this. Yeah, we can get back to this later if you guys have questions about it. See, one thing I didn't talk about, I guess that cross section on the bottom right is just sort of it's kind of hard to see, but there's the dark blue at the bottom is the existing average water level, and this blue line, the lighter blue line at the top shows the increased flooding up to elevation 2.8 in the Fresh River Basin. So you can see how it overtops the banks, overtops those little stone coastal engineering structures, and expands out onto the lawns on either side. Okay, we also looked at modifying the culvert under Surf Drive. I think this was one of the biggest surprises to me with this study. And basically we found that, I'll tell you what we found and then I'll tell you why, but that increasing the size of this culvert is not going to help at all. I was very surprised by that, but this is what the model showed, that, you know, it's not the main feature that's causing attenuation of that water. A lot of it is that shoal that we talked about in the previous slide. So in terms of minimizing potential for shoaling at the entrance, with this particular alternative, that seaward flowing currents are reduced, so it has less of an ability to flush material out on the outgoing tide. Those sediment pulses coming in on storms are a little bit weaker. So there's a mixed sort of reaction to this alternative. Again, no change in the percentage of longshore sediment transport captured by the jetties. So we classify this as being partially met. In terms of improving tidal exchange without increasing risks of upland flooding, we did not find any change in tidal range under non-storm conditions, and only slightly higher flood risk to properties around the Fresh River during that storm condition. And that was that yellow line that was shown on that previous graph. So it does expand out into some of the yards, but it doesn't impact, I think it impacts 1 or 2 homes in that area with up to elevation 2.3. So basically we said that goal was not met. So we're not able to improve tidal exchange, and we do increase flooding in the upland areas. Improving ecosystem habitat, there's no change in tidal range, no change in residence time, that goal is not met. Improved water quality, again, no change in range and no decrease in pollutant loads, so that goal was not met. Alternative 4 is modifying the jetties at the entrance to Fresh River. So there's some pictures of what we're talking about here. This involves increasing the length of those jetties by 30 feet and bringing the elevation up to elevation, approximately right now, about elevation 6 in ABD 88. I will say that, if this moves into further design and engineering, those numbers could change a little bit, but this is sort of the design we're looking at right now. So you can see, hopefully you can see in the bottom picture, the extended jetties in relation to the existing jetties. And then the upper picture, you can see sort of the light gray area are the existing jetties, and the darker ones are sort of the expansion of those jetties. So this particular alternative, there's no change to the ability of the channel to sort of naturally flush sediment out of the channel, but it does reduce the amount of material that can get into the channel because the jetties are trapping it. So that goal is partially met. There's no direct change in tidal range, although, and no increase in risk of flooding areas, but we feel like there's an indirect impact on improving tidal exchange because we're not going to have blockages anymore. So that goal is partially met. Again, with improving ecosystem habitat, no change in tidal range, no change in residence time, but again, those indirect impacts to habitat because the channel is not blocked as often anymore. And same with water quality. So those last two goals are partially met. Okay, and then the final one is implementing stormwater BMPs. So these BMPs are sort of structural BMPs. We wanted to identify some sort of green alternatives. Like many of you are probably familiar with that alternative at the end of Mill Road as you go down the right, and it sort of goes into, what is that, Crossins Creek, thank you. I love that system because it's a green sort of natural system. It's got some sort of gray infrastructure underneath it, but it was a great design, and it removes, pollutants and nutrients from that stormwater before it enters Salt Pond. We wanted to look for something like that here, but the opportunities were really limited. What we found, we looked at rain gardens, which are basically sort of swales that have sort of a certain sediment type in them and plants, and they will filter out a lot of the pollutants. We looked at a constructed wetland back over near that isolated wetland, but found that both of those alternatives would involve impacts to private property as well as increase in flooding during storms. So we ruled those out, and we instead just looked at structural BMPs. So that's something that you would install, for example, in this upper left picture, something you would install at that area where that grate is, and it would essentially filter out bacteria and nutrients. So instead of going through this whole table, just the first three goals aren't met, and the bottom one to improve water quality is partially met with this alternative. Okay, recommendations and next steps. This table on the right just kind of summarizes some of the things that I just told you. So we've got the 5 alternatives, the number of goals that they achieve. So you can see that alternative 2 and 4 achieve 4 of the goals, or at least partially meet 4 of those 4 goals. Environmental impacts range from minor and moderate to, with a stormwater BMP, for example, that's minor environmental impact. There's a little bit more of an impact when you're talking about dredging and the culvert and with the jetties. But I don't think that any of those are insurmountable, and I do think any of these projects could be permitted. It's not like they're prohibited or the regulations don't allow them. In terms of permitting difficulty, it ranges from low to moderate back to low for the stormwater system. We're still developing costs over here on the right, so that's something that I know that the DPW will certainly be interested in helping them to decide which one of these alternatives, if any, to move forward with. So what the study is showing is that, the town will need to consider potentially proceeding with design and permitting for the dredging, for the jetty modification, and for the stormwater BMP alternatives, either separately or all together. Any one of them would have a benefit. All of them together would have a greater benefit. And we would recommend we are recommending, seeking grant funding for the design and permitting of any one of these that the town wants to move forward with. Unfortunately, the grant program that funded this study removed projects from next year's eligibility that require engineering design and permitting. They're not funding engineering design and permitting this year in this grant program, so we can't go back to them, this same program for this project to further any parts of it. We're also going to end up making some recommendations for improved sediment management when the DPW does go down and clear the inlet. Those are going to be sort of structured around putting more of the material to the west side and helping to build up those dunes along the edge of Surf Drive to provide more resiliency to the road and, everything that's behind it. Those dunes right now, the ones to the west of this inlet they're just a sliver. And, when I was looking at it years ago, they were probably 30, 40 feet wide. So they've really diminished over the years, especially this winter. And I think one last thing I'll leave you with without going into too much detail is that, we're going to recommend or encourage the town to review the recommendations that were in the Surf Drive vulnerability study. So what that study showed for this low-lying neighborhood area is that, you're really vulnerable. And by 2050, there's going to be flooding during high tides almost daily in these neighborhoods. And it's going to impact your ability to drive around and do the things that you do. Under storms, there's definitely going to be flooding, but the worst case to me is to think about flooding during high tide. So if twice a day I'm impacted by getting into my driveway or going down the street, that worries me. So we're going to recommend that they go back and look at that study for this neighborhood. I think the recommendations for this neighborhood and that study were to elevate the end of Mill Road and to elevate Surf Drive to cut off some flood pathways that can, impact this neighborhood. If you do something like that, and you're also doing a few of these other alternatives, you wouldn't have to build those berms or raise those seawalls in order to, with alternative 2, in order to prevent flooding of those neighboring properties. And one other thing I forgot to say that I'm just remembering is that with alternative 2, with the dredging, you could also add a component, which would be adding a tide gate to the culvert. So you would prevent, during storms, you'd prevent the water from coming in during storms. It would be sort of a one-way flapper valve type thing. So you'd prevent the water from coming in during storms, but you'd allow the water to go out once the Vineyard Sound water receded. You'd allow the water to go out from rainwater from Sitter's Pond. That type of system can be controlled, I guess, mechanically, but many times it's done just by, manpower. So there are have been concerns in some towns that, there's room for human error. So what if everybody in town's too busy to go out and put the tide gates up or something like that? So for that reason, a lot of the times the regulatory agencies don't really like the tide gate option very well. But it's something that could be considered if the town wants to move forward with any of these options to mitigate impacts of flooding. I think that's it. So, yeah, I'm going to open this up to questions and comments, and I will try to document. Okay.
And if you wouldn't mind just letting us know who you are with the question.
Lane. You want me to? Oh, here I am. My family's owned the house for 65 years, and I've certainly seen a lot going on there. But we've also been begging the town for a number of years to do something. And I'd like to think that with all that you've done from the Woods Hole Group and all, that we're going to get something done about the Fresh River, not just talked about. It's it's got more debris in it than I've ever seen, and it smells. And as I said, I'm on 46 Fresh River Lane. You can see my house on the right, on the picture there. And I've been in touch with the town for about 10 years now, so I haven't seen anything done. And I think it's time to do it, not just talk about it. And I'm grateful you all came. And I hope Woods Hole Group can kick us in the butt and get us going.
Excuse me, can we just keep everything orderly?
Yeah.
If you wouldn't mind just letting us know your name, and if you speak into the mic, FCT TV can pick up what the question is.
I'm June Tadaro, and I live at 4 Fresh River Lane. So I'm impacted by the marsh that's in front of my house also. And I just wanted to know the time frame, because there has been a lot of talk for years about doing something, but it's been slow coming. So I'm interested in the time frame, what you think all this, how long this is going to take. Do you have any idea?
I mean, I can offer some ideas, and it would depend on which alternative the town decides to move forward with. They could decide to move forward with multiple alternatives, but I'll try to give you a time frame for the ones that I understand. So the dredging part, in terms of permitting, we have, the town has permits right now to dredge a portion of Fresh River. We would just have to modify those permits to include a bigger area. That could probably be done, you'd be ready to go in a year. That assumes all these comments I'm going to make assume the town has the money to do these. So they've got to go out and find grant funding for some of this money. Jim's going to, I guess, put in potentially an article at town meeting. He can speak to that in a second. But everything I say, we're going to say, assumes that the town's got the money to do the projects. So the dredging would be about a year. Modifying the jetties, you'd have to do the engineering design, permitting, and then construction. I'd say that's probably 2.5, maybe 3 years out before you could build that project. What were the others? BMPs could be done within a year or less, probably. And then culvert, well, I mean, we could probably modify the culvert and have it done in probably 2 to 2.5 years as well, but it's not one of the ones we're recommending. But so that gives you an idea.
A 5-year period, would you say that's reasonable?
I think 5 years would be plenty for any one of these. I think dredging could be done in a year, BMPs in 6 months. Jetties would take probably 2.5 to 3 years. And all that assumes the town has the money to do it.
Thank you.
Paul Smith, we're at 310 Mill Road. We've run up onto the Fresh River. We had the house for about 20 years. When we first were there, we could go back in the evenings and see the herring run. Not a sign of them since. So I'm very enthusiastic about the project and share the concerns about like to see this move to some action rather than talk. On a separate matter, on the culvert, I had been informed, maybe accurately or inaccurately, that the lifespan of that culvert is fixed, and that there's degradation in the culvert itself, and that it is it's queued up to be replaced at some point. So I'd be curious about whether the less impactful or negative reactions to the new culvert being a part of the solution, when they finally get to the point of doing that culvert, would your recommendations be to keep it exactly the same?
My recommendation, if they get to, if they need to replace the culvert.
If they replace the culvert, would your recommendation be to replace it the same or make it larger?
It would not be to make it larger because it needs to be larger, honestly. I'm going to lump this in with the alternatives for the Surf Drive resiliency study. So one of the recommendations there was to raise the elevation of Surf Drive. If we do that, we could make a bigger culvert there. The bottom of it should still be at the elevation that this one is right now. So I don't think you're going to get a lot of benefit from a bigger culvert, but if you raise the road, you do have the opportunity to do that if, you know, if the town wants to do that. But I don't think you're going to get a big benefit out of it.
It's just strikes me a little counterintuitive, but you'd think it's a bottleneck. If you remove the bottleneck, you'd have greater flow. But
Yeah, that's what I thought too. That's why I told you I was most surprised by that that finding that the engineers came up with.
and does the culvert have to be round? Can it be oval shaped to allow the same height and depth, but wider to provide more throughput?
This one is oval. It's kind of hard to tell, but it is. And it doesn't really matter the shape of it, just so long as the cross-sectional area is, you know, the same.
I'm Greg Mills. We live at 83 Walker Street. With respect to the culvert, I'm wondering what assumptions you made about continued excavation by the DPW. As you say, currently, they excavate almost monthly on average. Is your analysis of changing the culvert in size, what assumptions were made about periodic excavation? Could one of the benefits of a larger culvert be that the town doesn't need to excavate as frequently?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And what we found with enlarging the culvert is that, you know, there's sort of mixed results in terms of minimizing the need for the town to come in there and dredge. So it says right here that sediment transport potential on the outgoing tide is decreased. So you're not going to get as good sort of natural flushing by the tidal currents as those tides exit Fresh River. On the other hand, those landward pulses of sediment that occur during storms are going to deposit a little bit less sediment in the Fresh River. So it's sort of a mixed bag. I'm not quite sure I'm answering your question, but we didn't look specifically at, you know, this coupled with the town's continued sort of dredging, how that would affect things. We just assumed that if it's blocked, the town's going to come in and dredge it, assuming there's no plovers or anything like that around.
Right, but if it is less frequently blocked by virtue of larger size, then the town wouldn't need to excavate.
Absolutely, but we didn't find that would be the case with this enlarged culvert. Okay, yeah. We did find that with dredging Fresh River. They're going to have to come in there less often and dredge it.
Rob Tuckman, 215 Walker Street. Well, on that same topic, when you look at the elevation drawing at the beginning, you notice that the sand width of the beach on the east side is much wider than on the west side. And then you commented that, in fact, it would be helpful to put more sand on that western side to support the existing road. My understanding is that the DPW protocol is to remove the sediment and put it on the eastern side. Does that then increase the entrainment of sediment into the system? Or is there a benefit just by changing the operational procedure of the DPW to put sediment on the west?
The answer to the question, yes and yes. So there is a benefit to them putting it on the western side. We'd start to build that beach up, and the elevation of the beach with respect to the jetties, you know, right now on the eastern or western side is much lower. And if we can stop putting material on the eastern side, that elevation will drop and we'll have less of a chance for that material to spill over the top of the jetties and land in the channel. So we're gonna make some recommendations for just, you know, operational recommendations for dredging and materials management as a part of this.
Might I ask the DPW whether there are any procedural impediments to doing that? Or is that something that you could do? Thank you.
Get Terry. Hi, John Mullen, 123 Bywater Court. I'm on the original picture. I've got the sandbar right in my backyard, our backyard. Jane's family's been there since '67. Interesting on the culvert, it used to be not an oval, but a half shell, much wider, yeah. Our fence is right there. That's all in our backyard. Couple things. I've offered the town to come into our yard with that long reach excavator every year that they've been doing the end, because I've seen a big improvement with that.
Yeah.
With water flow, to come in, and I've gotten a front neighbor, and Joe is across the street. Of course, he's gonna be putting in a bunch of plantings, so he can't really let anybody in there next, but I've gotten at least the four of us on either side to allow the town to come there and clean up, but the town DPW manager, or whoever, he's adamantly against that. I think it would save an awful lot of money. I even agreed we'd sign release forms. We would pay for it ourselves for the repairs of our properties. But that got turned down. I also own a machine shop, or I've sold it, but now I still operate it. And I've offered to build a storm gate that would operate automatically out front and stop. And the DPW said, we don't have manpower to operate that. I was like, in today's electronic world, if we can get a camera down there, and when storm's coming, you can just, from your office, Falmouth DPW, push a button and have that close. I had Doug Brown was very for it, but never went anywhere. I don't know what else. Like I say, I've offered. My fence right now is old and rotted. It wouldn't matter. We could take that down, and I've got to replace it probably next year, maybe this year. But the offer still stands. It would help to clean that up an awful lot. It would be really easy for the town for that. That's it. Anything else, Sean?
I might just speak to both of those points. So the dredging that we were envisioning, we talked to at least one contractor, and they think they can build some sort of a ramp from the road to the edge of that shoal, get the equipment out there on the shoal, and start dredging, and removing the north end and pulling it back. So I don't think they would need to use your properties. We want to be careful that we don't get so close to the edges of those structures that we start to undermine them, so that we're going to, if it moves forward, there would not that need to be that considered in the design. I think we did some calculations, about 1,000 cubic yards would need to be removed. So that's more than what you see as sort of the subaerial part of the shoal extends further into the subaqueous part. Take about 70 truckloads to get that material out of there. Or maybe they could just move it across the road with equipment and start to build the dune there. So maybe, fewer truckloads, but that's that. And as far as the tide gate, we have permitted and installed a couple of tide gates. That system, that's electronic system, is called a SCADA system. And, maybe that's something that can be considered. If the town wants to move forward with that, then they can. I think it is better than a manually operated one, because there's always, we're always subject to, human error. Yeah. Yeah, that would definitely be a part of the design.
Hi, my name is Ralph Roberto from 15 Seagull Lane. I had a couple questions. So when the shoal that we're seeing there was caused, is the conclusion that that was caused by a storm pushing sand through the culvert and busting?
For the most part, yes.
Okay, and then I just want to make sure I understand it all. On slide 18, it seemed like what you were saying is the pond water quality was good. The sound quality water is good. It is this basin that is not. And in fact, it's impaired with both some of that does go back to a public beach, as you mentioned. So I had a couple questions about that. One is there any requirement to remediate that? Just 5 years does not seem reasonable, or even a year. There's no requirements if you're to do something about that? It seems serious.
The state has established what they call TMDLs, total maximum daily loads of nutrients. and other contaminants in waters that are classified by the state. This particular water body does not have a TMDL, nor is it classified by the state. It's just, it's not included in the analysis they did. But we know that, it's impaired if you use the state standards. So that's why we made the recommendations to try to address it.
So the number one recommendation then to increase the flow. So the jetties will hope they'll prevent sand from being forced back in. But it does sound like the size of that culvert, I didn't quite get that. What is the rationale in the model that predicts a larger culvert does not produce flow? I don't understand.
It's just, it's the tidal hydrodynamics of the system. So the thing that the part of the system that's preventing that tide range from being bigger than it is more that shoal that's inside Fresh River.
But that shoal's going to be gone.
Yeah.
So that's what I was getting hung up on. It seems
Yeah.
like circular logic. What you're saying, the reason why it's because the shoal, well, the shoal is there because so
Yeah.
that shoal was removed and you had a larger culvert. It seems to me you wouldn't have sand.
I think that with the larger culvert, what we found was that you would have the tendency for more seaward, landward pulses of this material. So you're going to get more sediment landing in the Fresh River with that bigger culvert. Without the positive benefits of increased tide range. So again, I was surprised by the finding as well, but I have to trust the engineers in the office.
No, I'm just more for understanding.
Yeah,
Thank you very
sure.
much.
My name is Brian Noe, and my house is at 14 Herringbrook Lane. Fresh River runs right through my backyard. My house was built in 1973. The basement is basically at sea level. So, like today, when the water is flowing, I've got maybe 8 inches between where the water level is and the top. So, anytime there's a blockage, I get flooding. And it's particularly this last stint when the plovers were preventing digging out, I had standing water in my lawn for a month, and the lawn turned into sponge. Not only that, when I bought the house in 2019, conservation required our previous owners to put in a row of shrubs to prevent erosion. Most of that row of shrubs is now gone, including a very large willow tree, because I've lost probably 10 to 12 to 14 inches of lawn because of tidal flow. So I would like to argue for something being done as soon as possible, and then also for the benefit of DPW. What helps is when the dredging is as deep as it can possibly be in the inlet channel, because that keeps the water level low, and therefore it doesn't come up to the edge of my lawn, because when the tide runs against the lawn, it just eats the lawn away. So I'm losing property. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that all makes sense to me, and we did have a particularly bad winter season, but they couldn't dredge with the plovers there for a while. I don't know if someone in this room went out there and did it by hand. I don't know what happened, but it happened a couple of times, and it was flowing. So that was a beautiful thing to see. What was I going to say? I mean, some sort of like dike or berm along the edge of your property might be something to consider. Okay, all right. And then also the dredging part, just, by lower, if we can dredge it low, like you said, then that sort of lowers the whole system. Yeah. So that's one of the goals. Yeah.
Kathy Mortensen, Pinot Way. I like to talk about water quality issues on the west side of Cedars Pond. We do not have sewer, just so you know that everybody on the west side, we just all have septic systems or cesspools. The storm drains on our street, Pinot Way. There's a pipe just running straight into the pond. We talk about pollutants. do you still do storm drains like that? Yes.
No, we don't. In today's world with conservation, we would be required to mitigate that outfall with some type of BMP or a structural measure, or non-structural, but most likely structural, that would improve water quality prior to discharge. Yeah, well, we have an inventory of all the outfalls, and it's a long list of outfalls that need improvement. There's years and years and years of work to get that done. And not at this point in time, though.
As Ed DeWitt, I live with her. As a follow-up to that, I think one of the things of this is maintenance. And we've already heard about the problem with money and the ability to do this. And I would just like it entered into the comments that no matter what public works projects you do, if you're not committed to maintaining all of that, including the BMPs, which seem to be a really important project here, it doesn't make any sense to do anything because it's just going to be short term. And we need to be looking at this for the long term, which includes, what are we going to do with Surf Drive and a lot going on. Thank you.
Yeah, agreed.
Hi, I'm Breck Owens. I live at 88 Cedars Pond on the west side. We have a similar outflow from Cedars Pond that flows directly into the pond. It was recently rebuilt into a massive thing, whereas before it was small. It's kind of a disaster. I'm really shocked at the fluid dynamics results. I mean, I'm a fluid dynamicist by training. I'm really kind of shocked that culvert doesn't have a lot of drag with the water flow, and so it seems intuitively obvious to me that it's restrictive. And from stories from the past, the Greg's kids, 30 years ago or something, used to go through that culvert with a canoe. And so that culvert was bigger in the past. And I also don't understand what is unique about the recent storm that caused that silting up of fresh water. I mean, we've had, over the last 60 years, I'm sure we've had plenty of hurricanes and other things of comparable storms that would have also contributed that kind of sediment into the fresh water. So I guess in your presentation, I don't understand what caused that silting to happen in the first place. Why is that unique to this present period as compared to the past? So I'm just confused.
A couple of things on that. The shoaling inside Fresh River Basin isn't unique to this year. I mean, the shoal has been there before, and the town has had to dredge it before. It was worse this year, and one thing I'll say is that one thing I didn't show on these slides was we looked at sort of mechanisms for blockage of the inlet as a part of this study. And one of the big mechanisms was when the water level in Vineyard Sound gets to be, I'll just say right now, just quite high. And so one thing I'll say about one of those storms, actually two of those storms we had this winter, is that two of those storms had like the 8th and 6th highest water levels in Woods Hole since the beginning of since that gauge has been recording, so since the 1920s. So the water levels, we had 2 storms, which those water levels were really high this winter. And what that had the effect of doing is causing a lot of erosion and mobilization of sediment that's in those dunes. You know how I said the dunes now are really thin? And so a lot of that material that was in those dunes got mobilized and then just was landed in the channel and then got sort of that material transported into the Fresh River in these sort of landward dominated pulses of sediment transport. So I don't think it's unique. It's just that we had a lot more of that material available this winter than we have in other winters. Does that answer your question?
You're going to do evacuation, you're going to do excavation. Does this mean you're going to end up doing it routinely? I mean, you're going to have to do it this time, but is this going to be an ongoing thing every few years? You have to do the dredging again?
I mean, our recommendation would be is when that shoal builds up to, something that's visible there, that's sort of blocking drainage of the Fresh River, the town should get in there and dredge it. And that's not that uncommon because they dredge, many of the inlets here every year or sometimes twice a year. So it's just a part of maintaining the system, or could be. But if they were to do the other project, which was to rebuild the jetties, then hopefully we'd have to do it less often.
Hi, Leslie. I'm Jim O'Shaughnessy from 52 Pond Road. One question for you on your reference to a broader evaluation of Surf Drive and Mill Road, where you mentioned that elevation could be a solution for those roads. Is there a metric on that? Does the report talk about how much Surf Drive and Mill Road might be built up under that scenario?
Yeah, there is. I can give you the reference, or if you just Google Surf Drive Vulnerability Report, you're going to get the town's website, and there's a lot of really good instructive reports and graphics and sort of visualizations that we have up there. But the preferred recommendation for this low-lying neighborhood, so in the Fresh River area, was to elevate Mill Road and elevate Surf Drive. And that would cut off flood pathways, both from Salt Pond, which impact this area or will in the future, and then also from Surf Drive. And so there are metrics there. There's elevations on how high to raise it, when to do it. You don't have to do it right now, but it's something that the town, in our opinion, could be planning to do in the next, 10 to 20, 30 years.
Okay, so no action planned around that
Other than start, designing it and planning it and getting the money to do it and things like that. Because you can't do any of these resiliency alternatives you can't just, say, okay, I'm now going to do it. I mean, you've got to plan for it and get the money and, do the engineering design and the permitting and have the money for construction. So it takes a while.
And then my other question was for Mr. McLaughlin. And that I think may be partially answered, that if the jetties solution is adopted and funded, DPW would maintain the ability to get into those channels and dredge them on the fewer occasions when they might fill up. Thank you.
Yes, a couple things that should mention. One is, I'm as surprised as everyone else in the room with regard to the size of the culvert. We certainly thought that was probably a no-brainer that the culvert had to be bigger. So we're equally surprised at the results of the Woods Hole Group investigation regarding that particular item. With regard to the jetties, I do want to talk just for a minute about what we did at Salt Pond Jetty. We widened those out and lengthened them. We also put in a hard bottom, which allows us to maintain it much more efficiently. And also we have access on either side, which previously we did not. As soon as that work was completed, which was this past winter, of course, it shoaled right up. And the reason that that happens is really storm related. It's not that it was intended that the jetty improvements would completely eliminate the need to maintain that channel. It's always been something that was contemplated that we would have to continue to do, hopefully not as frequently. What compounded the problem this past spring and summer has been the plovers that prevented us from getting in there and removing the sediment, and it just got worse and worse and worse until just about a week ago when we were allowed to get in there and dig it out. So I would think the same situation would occur here. We would look at putting in a hard bottom and redesigning the entire jetty system, extending it out, most likely to the extent that Leslie's mentioned, but including the hard bottom and also improving the accessibility on either side to be able to maintain sediment that will inevitably build up in that channel, in that inlet. And one of the things that will be helpful in terms of rebuilding the jetties is to have good access on either side, so that when we get in on the west side, we'd be able to just deposit the material that we dig out right there in the dune area, as opposed to having to move it around and truck it, or if we only have access on the east side. So one of the other benefits of rebuilding these jetties is to have good equal access on either side and allow us to be able to place material more judiciously. So, yes.
I appreciate your reference to the plovers this year, and I think maybe all of us noted the editorial in the Enterprise seeming to sympathize with the plight of the herring, who were blocked from getting to their spawning grounds or breeding grounds. We know there is a group that advocates for the plovers. Who in the town, in your judgment, would be the group to turn to advocate for the herring?
Okay, I'm not sure that the Conservation Commission would be the committee that would be involved with that, but I can tell you that the plovers are endangered, and it's not a question of town protection. It's state and federal, and there's a monitor that actually goes up and down along Surf Drive during this time of year to let us know when we can and cannot work there, and that's through, I believe, Mass Audubon is subcontracted out from the state to be able to do that. But it's really state controlled, nothing that we have or that conservation has any direct control over at this point in time. It's unfortunate, of course, and we're always anxious to get out there and get the work done. But it's just a situation that we have to deal with, unfortunately. I think, is there anyone else that hasn't had a question that wants to speak before we introduce people for a second time? No? Okay.
I'm curious, when you look at the salt pond, they dug it out and they just put it right on the western side. And if we get wind and water at 30 miles an hour, maybe 40 miles an hour, that's just going right back in again. I mean, why can't they move that down the road where it's totally bare now? I don't know why, but it doesn't seem like every year they can't do that. My more important question was, what model are you referring to that says like the culvert is not going to do any good to make the culvert any bigger? Who did that model? Did Woods Hole Group do it?
Woods Hole Group put it together. Yeah, it's not like a numerical model, more analytical model. So using equations of, fluid dynamics and sediment transport and things like that.
So I would suggest that I understand that if you make the culvert bigger, then you've got incoming problem bigger than you had before. But I don't understand because in the years when I first started coming in 1980, there was that big oval culvert under there. And like these people that are here earlier than me were driving canoes under it. It had incredible flow. There was all eelgrass in there. There were eels and fish and bluefish and everything in there. I know everything's changed. And I know the storms are more frequent and some stronger, whatever. What I was going to say is make the culvert bigger for the outflow and put the storm gate on there. Not a tidal gate, a storm gate. Don't call it a tidal gate. I don't think the state likes tidal gates, but a storm gate, just so you close that gate for a storm to stop that from coming in, but then open it and you're going to help the outflow with that bigger culvert.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I would ask about, like you're talking about the resiliency study. It's interesting because in 2017 or 18, when that first came out, the original prediction was for our yard at 123 by water. I think I'm ground zero, or we're ground zero. We were going to have daily high tide in our backyard in 2030. Now they've changed that to 2050. They took the state model. It was a Mass DOT model that was made, and they decided to go to like the 4th level, and they thought that was appropriate. And it doesn't seem like it was appropriate at all. So I'm asking the same question about this model, and are there levels of accuracy to the model, and what levels of accuracy are you guys making, sorry, but you scientists making a choice by?
Yeah.
What's the accuracy of the way you're using that model?
I can't speak to the accuracy. I'd have to go back and ask the engineers. I apologize for that.
You understand what I'm saying?
I do
about
understand what you're saying.
study?
I did want to say something about how, the predictions for your yard were high tide flooding in 2030. And that was all based on the state's projection of, rates of sea level rise.
Well,
so
they gave you 5 different levels.
Exactly,
And
right.
Woods Hole chose the 4th level.
No, Woods Hole did not. The state chose it, and Woods Hole followed what the state told us, said that they wanted to do in their statewide plan. So that's what we did. What we're saying now is that actual sort of rates of sea level rise that we're seeing are not tracking what the state chose, so not as high. And so basically what we're saying is if we predicted flooding in your yard in 2030, now maybe it's going to be 2040, 2050. Doesn't mean you should stop planning and thinking and trying to figure it out and what to do, but maybe it's just going to be a little bit delayed over what was originally projected.
I'm going to build a marina.
Very good, very good. Go for it.
Kidding. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I know your analysis of these options proceeded, I presume, in isolation. So you looked at each of them versus existing conditions. I'm just wondering, because there is some interaction, some interdependence, in particular between modifying the culvert and modifying the jetties. I'm wondering if you, let's say for your final report, can look at the combination of modifying both the jetties and the culvert. Because it may be that if the jetties are lengthened and raised in height, that may alter the dynamics of water flow in such a way that then enlarging the culvert might make a difference. It just seems to me that combination at least is one that should be examined.
Yep.
Just finally, thank you very much. And I wanted to know if the slides will be available to us in this current form.
Yes, so I will give them to Jim, and I think, Jim, can you post them on the town's website?
Yes.
Jim, did you have another question, Jim? No, okay. Oh, sorry.
To this question, so they are piling sand up to build that dune. They're not really building it, it's just a pile of sand. Okay, this may take a while to wind through and get all the recommendations and do something. In the interim, sand is being piled up on the west side. And this gentleman's point, when there's a strong wind, sand is blowing back in to the channel there. Is there can't we do something about that? Because it seems that would slow the progression of sand into, it seems just very simple to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to make some recommendations on sediment management during dredging that hopefully they can implement now and continue to implement them in the future.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sherry and John Bojanowski were at 30 Salt Pond. We might have missed it, but so you're saying you're making recommendations. Just curious, what is the format of that and when are you making those recommendations to the town?
So we're taking the feedback tonight. We are due to provide a draft report to CZM by I'd say this week. And then we'll take feedback from CZM next week. And we need to turn that report around, which will be available to anybody through the town's website. It will be available, I'd say, in the first week of July. Does that answer your question? Yeah, well, we're getting feedback now, and we're gonna get feedback from the town and from CZM between now and, next week. And then we'll put the recommendations in report form. As I said, that's gonna be on the town's website. You can read that, and then, it'll be up to the town to decide, and we'll continue to work with the town on trying to advance some alternatives and look for grant monies that could help, pursue any of these alternatives. I think Jim has some ideas about other funding, but we're going to try to work with the town and keep pressing for some changes here and some improvements here.
If I could just speak to that for a second. As Leslie mentioned, the availability of funding for design and permitting is not, it's not readily available. So what our intent is to place a funding request in for the November town meeting, and the exact amount, of course, we still have to determine, going back and forth with Woods Hole Group to try and get an idea of the order of magnitude of what's involved in terms of the design of some of these alternatives, and trying to put together a budget that we can submit to town meeting for approval. Because I don't think, well, from our perspective, waiting for grant opportunities and the time that it takes is probably not realistic in what we want to do and what I'm sure you want to do. You don't want to wait for 2 or 3 years for another grant. So that's our plan, is to put forward something for town meeting this November. Well, everything that Public Works does has to be funded through an article at town meeting. So that it's not just like there's a pot of money available for us to use in this discretionary way. It has to be approved at town meeting with some backup information. And even before it gets to town meeting, the first hurdle that we face in terms of funding any capital improvement projects is to present it to the finance committee and get their support before it even gets to town meeting. So there's, which all happens between now and November, but to do anything prior to that is, we just don't have that capability.
I mean, I guess I would also add to that is that before they do anything like that, they've got to have an idea of what they're asking the money to do. And so before this study, they didn't exactly know what needed to be done. And so, they've got to have a concrete idea of what needs to be done, go get the money, and then it can be done. Okay, we're trying. Thanks for coming. And, yeah, so this PowerPoint will be up on the website, the draft or the final report on the website, and I think FCTV will post this periodically or on some schedule. Thanks for coming.
Very much.